You there, boy. What decade is it?
Why, just the 90s, sir.
Then I haven't missed it. It's still the 90s, and there's time for...
So besides the second most recognizable tagline in video games, what does Klax have going for it? Well, it's a really good puzzle game from an era when people were making a bunch of really good puzzle games. Klax was originally an arcade game, and it got an enormous response. Atari immediately began porting it to every platform under the sun, which is why we have this Famicom version just 6 months after the arcade game was released. And I typically don't spread out my topic like this in Famidaily, but one of these ports marks the end of an era. Klax was the final official release for the Atari VCS. The Atari 2800 was an early competitor of the Famicom, but it was gone by 1985, so Japan never saw its version of Klax. The VCS was the most important precursor to the Famicom, the previous reigning champ of best-selling console. It lasted far longer than anyone would expect, but its time had finally come. Okay, back to the Famicom version of Klax. We haven't seen a port of an Atari games release on the Famicom yet. We've had Atari games, as in games made by Atari before they split into two companies. But this is the first game that we've seen by the new company that was called Atari Games. It's a bit of a surprise to see any of their games on the Famicom, since by 1990 they were in a court battle with Nintendo in one of the nastier lawsuits in video game history. That's really something for a person doing an NES chronology, but the 30-second version for this video is that Atari was suing Nintendo to try to break their hold on cartridge manufacturing in the US, and to do that they used the lawsuit to steal technical information from Nintendo, which they used to make unlicensed cartridges, of which Klax was one. Apparently Nintendo of Japan wasn't that concerned about this, since they had no problem licensing Famicom cartridges for titles by Atari Games. This only happens 3 times on the Famicom, so sorry Tubin fans, you'll just have to get the NES version. Of all the console games that Atari Games made, Klax was probably the best choice for a Famicom port. The arcade machine was relatively popular in Japan. The concept of Klax is that tiles are slowly flipping their way down a path towards you. They're coming in 5 rows, and you control a paddle that moves back and forth above a pit. The pit is 5 by 5, and the paddle itself can hold 5 tiles as well. Hitting the A or B button flips the top tile on the paddle's stack down into its well. If you miss catching a tile, then you get a strike, and when you're out of those strikes, the game is over. When you start the game, and every 5 levels, you're offered the opportunity to skip ahead 5 or 10 stages, and if you do so, you get additional strikes. With only 25 spots, that well can fill up awfully fast, but you can remove tiles by doing a match 3, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. A vertical stack only gets you 50 points, while a diagonal stack gets you 5,000, so it's definitely worth your while to build diagonally if possible. And naturally, there are multipliers for removing more than one set of 3, or triggering a chain reaction where removing some tiles causes others to fall into place to remove them. As you're playing, keep an eye out for the wild card tiles as well. They can match anything. There are 5 styles of stages in Klax. The most common is to just make Klax, the game's term for sets of 3. A step up from that is a requirement to make only horizontal Klax. You can do other ones, but they don't count. And one step beyond that is to make diagonal Klaxes. You might have a points requirement, and here creating the simple Klaxes won't cut it. You have to get those multipliers if you want to score big. The final type of stage just requires that you catch a certain number of tiles on your paddle. But inevitably, this number is higher than 25, so you'll have to eliminate tiles as you go. When you clear a stage's conditions, you get bonus points for how many tiles are coming down the track, as well as every empty space in the well. Then you move on to the next stage. A lot of stages begin with pieces already in the well or mounted on your paddle. You'll have to deal with them also. There are 100 stages in Klax, and no password or save system. You have to just clear the whole thing in one setting, if you really want to clear. At least they give you infinite continues. There are 8 different colored tiles that can come down the track at you. Early stages limit the variety, but later stages can get pretty nasty with this. You might build an elaborate layout to try to capture some points, only for the tile color that you need to never come. This is especially true if you're trying to build the most advanced shape, an X that fills the entire well. I basically spent my entire recording time trying to capture that, and inevitably, whatever color was really common while I set up my first 4 or 5 tiles suddenly dried up after that. Klax isn't that hard if you're just trying to build 3 in a row, but when you're trying to do something fancy, it can get challenging pretty quickly. And I think that's a really good thing here. The game has a high skill ceiling. The new player can just line up 3 in a row and make some decent progress, while the advanced player could try for more complicated patterns. The game even has settings to help you adjust the difficulty to whatever you feel is appropriate. Klax offers a 2-player mode, but it's really 2 players each playing their own game of Klax at the same time. You don't really affect each other as you play. There's also this slime ball mini-game in the options menu. It's basically a tech demo with no score or goal, just bounce the ball, and you can hit A and B to alter its trajectory. I can't say that the Famicom port was wildly popular, but it definitely has its fans. I saw more than one person refer to Klax as a masterpiece. It doesn't seem to have many fans, but the fans it does have are passionate. My own view is that I think this is one of the best puzzle games of the era. Yeah, it's pulling a bit of inspiration from Tetris, but there's 3 systems here that are interacting in interesting ways and don't really trip over each other. You've got the path of constantly moving tiles, and these tiles speed up during the stage, so you always have to be on your toes to catch them. The paddle and its stack offers a different challenge, where you need to control the flow of the tiles. Manipulating the stack that you keep on that paddle is one of the keys to Klax. And then there's the well itself, where you have to keep in mind the geometry that you're building. Other games might be having you match colors or shapes as they fall into a well, but Klax gives that concept an extra twist that really works. Unfortunately, it seems like Klax never went any further than the 23 ports it received at the time. Okay, I probably shouldn't count the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance ports in that count, but that's a lot of ports. It boomed big in the decade it was made for, but just as the tagline promised, once it was no longer the 90s, people decided it was no longer time for Klax. It's a shame because this is a fantastic game, and it's a fantastic port of a fantastic game. Klax deserved better.